stream and be in there for the comments. I'm actually going to shift around a little bit.
All right, I guess I'll start with my face.
That's an important part of this.
Not really.
You matter.
Not really. What's behind the face?
What's behind the face?
All right, and then go to the October meetup. The one that's live streaming. This one. All right. So, Chris, do you want to do a brief introduction for everybody here?
Yeah, you ready to go?
Yeah, ready to go?
Yep. We'll go ahead and start now.
Okay, so I'm Chris Hunt and currently employed by Ticketmaster, of which some people may have heard of. I have been an avid PowerShell user since the Monad days, so it is my tool of choice for pretty much everything. I also co-organized the Northern Virginia PowerShell User Group, so this is pretty cool to actually get to participate in another user group. This is the first time for me actually seeing a group of PowerShell users besides like the summit where it's hundreds of people, but to see how, you know, another city does it. So that's cool. So I guess as mentioned, I was the only author of the PoshSpec module that we published through the Ticketmaster GitHub repo. So I'm proud to say that I was the first person to publish something in the Ticketmaster repo targeting the Microsoft tech stack. So if you can look at their collection of things, and they have a great number of things that involve the Linux platform, for which, you know, is the primary stack for Ticketmaster, but I work on the team responsible for the Windows stack. So that's a bit about my background. Unless there's any questions, I can start telling you a bit more about PoshSpec.
Any questions from the group? I'll have some for later.
All right. So I guess a background about how about the technology that sort of inspired, I guess, the creation of such a tool. I mean, it's something that I've wanted to do for a while and never had I lost video. You guys still there? Come on. Sweet.
We're back. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Hey, we got the worst part out of the way, right? At least we have internet today.
At least it's not as bad as testing. All right. So like I was saying, so at Ticketmaster, the Windows side of things. Oh no, I think I lost you again. Okay. We have actually been pretty heavily invested in DSC for about 2 years. And at the moment, last I checked, we have somewhere between 500 and 600 servers running off of a single DSC pool server. And also, sort of over the last couple of years, have developed almost 100 custom resources for DSC. Most of them, I'd say half of them sort of specific to our application infrastructure, and then sort of some just making up for the fact that the DSC resource pool is still pretty new.
How many of those have you managed to contribute back upstream?
None so far, because they're all poor. They would. So like I said, we've been doing this about 2 years, and that has pretty much consisted of frantic coding. We have, I think it was almost 80 different types of servers. So besides, building the custom resources, building the configs, testing those, it was not executed in the most mature fashion for developing all that. But it was very aggressive to get, hundreds of servers under DSC management, so we'd stop building them by hand. One of the first things I was tasked with when I started Ticketmaster was to create a new custom resource for remote desktop services gateway servers. And so obviously the first thing I did was ask people, so where's our documentation for this? And the response I got was 4 different things. Not uncommon for any environment of any age that's survived past more than its first generation of admins. Things sort of get lost and translated. So I had like 3 different pieces of documentation, and I had this really old PowerShell script that did a bunch of manual checks to see if a server was working. So I got this, and I thought, okay, well, there are things on here that look clearly questionable. There are things on here I know that for a fact that we don't actually do. So the first thing I figured I was going to do is actually see what the servers did. And that's sort of the inspiration for PoshSpec. It's not rocket science to figure you can write pester tests to infrastructure testing. People have been talking about it for a while and doing it for a while. But the thing that really bothered me was how verbose writing a pester test was. Like, I'm going to write get service, 100 times with different names, different test names, different describe blocks. And like, I knew that the most time-consuming part of writing infrastructure tests was just hacking away at a keyboard, filling out all the requirements for, okay, thank you, streaking cat. Writing and
real quick, for those who don't know, can you talk a little bit about Pester?
Sure. So Pester is a unit testing, originally designed as a unit testing framework for PowerShell. It uses a behavior-driven design inspired language. And that the key parts of that are the describe keyword, the context keyword, and the it and should are all keywords that you would use if you were talking to anybody in any language about behavior-driven design. And that is, you sit down before you start writing code and sort of in plain English write what it's supposed to do. And that's the goal of Pester for PowerShell, is you can sit down and in sort of human readable syntax describe the functionality of a script or a module or a function or something. The big advantage of Pester is that it is also written in PowerShell and executes PowerShell. So there's really not a limit to what you can do with Pester. It's really, at the end of the day, a way to put a bunch of Boolean checks into a script and execute them and get a pretty green and red output. So you can sort of think of it as a way of just organizing a bunch of script snippets. And that's, again, that's what PoshSpec does. That's what Pester tests are, is just a bunch of script blocks. And I'll show you a little bit more detail of that too in a second. So again, I figured I could spend a day or two coming up with a sort of hacky way to generate Pester script blocks with much less syntax. So it would be easier to maintain, easier to read, and then just a lot less typing for me. So probably just makes sense to go ahead and get more into that. So if you're interested, repo is ticketmaster/PoshSpec. And then most of the information is on the wiki side. So, and this,
I realize now I never added my stuff to the wiki.
Yeah, nobody does, and that's sort of the downside of using the GitHub wiki. It's you think it's cool up front because you can just check out the wiki repo and like make changes to it and check it in, but wiki repos, you can't fork them, you can't do merge requests, so you lose all of that fun collaborative functionality of GitHub. So it seems kind of turns out to be really an awful way to manage documentation on a public repository. So actually, let me switch to this first. So this is what a PoshSpec script would look like. This is, I copied out sort of, if you wrote this all by hand in just sort of native Pester, this is what it would look like. So you can sort of see the difference here. The PoshSpec is much more terse, very straight, to the point. We're just testing a service, the service name, the property you want to test, and the condition you're looking for. So again, for those not familiar with Pester, this is...
Can you zoom in a little bit? It's kind of hard to see on the the table presenting. Thank you.
Good. Okay. This is the minimum amount of code you need.
Can we actually increase a little bit more? I'm sorry.
Yep.
I didn't wait for enough feedback from around the room. Let me know when it's readable, guys. All good to go?
Good to go?
Okay.
All right.
Yep, you're good.
Let me space it out too, so it's a little... So again, for a pester test, the basic you need is a describe block, and this is really just sort of a scoping construct. It doesn't really serve any purpose. It just holds a bunch of tests. And then the minimum you need to actually create a test is an it with a should. And you can have multiple shoulds in an it. So if you wanted to test the status and the description and I don't know, a bunch of other stuff, you can test all of those. You can assert or should all of those in a single test. And then this single test will either pass or fail if all of them are true, or it'll fail if any one of them fail. So I don't know if I tried to get this, but the text is just atrocious. So let me know if this is completely unreadable. Or maybe I can do this.
The green text is unreadable, yeah.
Yeah. Does that make it a little bit better?
Or
I can switch to native blue again.
Yeah, let's try switching it to the light color, the same theme as the top.
I tried that. White does not help. The problem is because the pester output is defined by right host. I can't control.
Oh, right.
The text color, so it's always going to be this obnoxious neon green.
Does it work okay on a black background, maybe? Probably not.
Yeah, it is. We can try that.
Yeah, it is. We can try that.
Let me just go back to the default. That's not what it's supposed to look like. Okay.
That's readable.
Does that look better? Okay. Yeah, most of the output's going to be this funny green color anyway. So you can see this is really simple test. Obviously, we have one describe, and within that we have a single test. And it's green. It's got a plus sign. That means it passed. And the output you get is basically just this string. So you're not getting any additional feedback, I guess, from the test. So the only information you get is based on the name of the test that you're providing. So that's another big part of what PoshSpec does, is dynamically generates these names based on the type of test, the property you're testing, the parameters that you're testing for, and the condition that you're testing. So again, like I said, if you were writing, say, 100 of these tests, you would have to sit here and come up with this string for all of them, and you'd probably cut and paste, and you'd probably, forget to change some of them, and you'd end up with tests that have confusing names or are just named poorly, or by the time you get to the end of the file, you're just like test some stuff and you don't even have a useful description anymore. So again, going back to the PoshSpec version, let me just run these ones. You can see I'm generating the same test name dynamically. And then also, if I'm testing a different service or a different condition, those become part of the name as well. So I don't have to think of a clever name for all my tests. I know that my tests are going to be well named. When they fail or pass, or when I just go back to look at them, I can read them and actually understand what's going on behind the test. Because like I said, there is no additional pester output. Well, you can get into that, but that's another topic. So the other sort of important function of PoshSpec is creating a public repository of these sort of helper functions. So you see in each of these describe blocks, service, file, registry, these are actually just functions. And the sort of purpose of the function is simply to provide a structure for accepting necessary parameters. At the end of the day, all they're going to do is generate the same sort of Pester syntax. So you can see this is based off of the demo file that you can find in the repository if you want to see kind of just a general, here are some of the things that out of the box you can easily test. So if I can run this whole thing, let's see, yep. So this is what a failed test looks like. And this is what really came in handy for me when I was trying to figure out, based on our documentation, what was real or not. So what I ended up doing, wrote a script similar to this that had somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 different tests, I think, based on all of the documentation I could find, talking to all the engineers. You know, basically, here's every possible thing that we've ever configured for this type of server in the past, dumped them in this file, and then ran a test against a production server. And lo and behold, like half of the tests failed. So straight away, proved the sort of value of infrastructure testing and the lack of value of not updating your documentation. So the sort of ancillary benefit is by writing this test, I'm also sort of documenting our infrastructure. So this is, it's a good sort of stepping stone if you're getting into DSC and configuration management. You're going to need to test your infrastructure at some point, both testing the assumptions of how your server is actually configured, but then also after you do some configuration to test the fact that your configuration is working as you assume it is. So I guess I'll take a break. Are there any questions so far?
Any questions?
I can't see anybody, so I don't know if everybody's glazed over or
Everybody's
really
avoiding
interested.
eye contact. So I need Pester to run PoshSpec, correct?
That is correct.
That is correct.
You need
Okay.
Pester. In fact, it is Pester. So I am
Right,
not.
right.
I'm not executing any of the testing functionality. So we can step back in here, and I'll show you a little bit of some of the magic behind the curtains. So there are sort of two functions that do, well, really one function that does the majority of the work. There's this get PoshSpec param, which sort of knows how to go through and just generate all the stuff that you need. Mostly it's putting together that testing name string. You see, various ways of building that string depending on what kind of information you pass in, and also building the Pester expression. So both of those things get put together here, and ultimately on the back end will generate sort of this code as a string in memory.
Okay. We have a couple questions from the chat room. First question: can I just drop these commands into my Pester test files?
Yes, you can use PoshSpec and classic Pester and just random PowerShell all works in one file. It's that's again, Pester, PoshSpec, all built in PowerShell, and you can take full advantage of PowerShell to sort of solve various testing problems. So one thing I don't demonstrate, but you can do, is if you know, say, you have 5 services you want to test. You don't have to write a test for each of them. You can just do a for each. Oops. You know, service and services. I guess you could probably do it here. And change this to service, and now you can test as many services as you want, and you have, again, very simple, concise script to do it. Or if you have CMDB or some external, system of truth that you want to query, you could dynamically build a list of things you want to test as well. So again, these are just functions. You're just basically functions that generate strings. And
kind of follow-up question then is, since it's all PowerShell, what version of PowerShell do I need? What's the minimum?
The minimum for this at the moment is 5.
The minimum for this at the moment is 5.
I think. I haven't tested it, but I believe there is some magic that goes on in here. Where is it again? This guy. Execution context.invoke command.expand string is a sort of PowerShell engine command that you can pass it a string, and this is like the method call that does string interpolation. So if you pass it a string with some $sign variable name inside of it, this will go ahead and replace the variables with the value of the variables. So this gets by.
We have a follow-up question to that.
Okay.
If you're finished with your explanation.
PowerShell version, are there any dependencies on commandlets that appear in server 2012 or higher and not 2008? So if I were in 2008, could I run it in default?
Right. So the question is it just PowerShell 5, or are there things that'll break on 2008 R2, even if I have PowerShell 5 installed?
I can't remember. Some of these probably yes, but the module itself will load. You just might not be able to do things. I think get package, is not available. So you wouldn't be able to use the package function. But the module itself, because there's no sort of a design decision, is to not define any requirements within the PSD1 or anything. So the module will load. If you go and try and use some of these functions and you use them on a system that they're not supported, you're going to get unknown command.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. Well, I guess we had a follow-up to that, actually. So things like file registry service would work. Yeah, I'm assuming that's correct.
Yeah, I mean,
like
file
the basic
is,
ones will work across version 2 and forward.
File's straightforward. Yeah. It's actually using the built-in functionality of Pester. Pester, if you pass just a path to should exist, it knows how to basically turn that into a I believe it just does test path. So
okay, then the last 2 questions then. So Mike Shepard noted that this looks like it runs on a single server. I think I remember seeing an issue for this, but is there any plan to run it remotely or be able to execute across multiple nodes?
Yeah, there's been quite a bit of discussion about that, and pretty much I think it was the first or second issue that was mentioned. And I have not yet found an argument to add the complexity to do that, because Pester is not designed to do that. So what I would end up having to do is build a distributed Pester runner, and the Pester output is not designed necessarily for being consumed through multiple endpoints. That being said, I have executed these fine through, just invoke command. So one of the things I will do.
I was going to say, so that would be the preferred method then.
Yeah. So one of the things
you're going to run against a bunch of nodes, run it via.
I could create a repository on the server of infrastructure tests, and then just invoke command, test server functionality A, and then you'll get back the output from Pester, just as you were if you were sitting at the server. And there's no limit to that, obviously. The great thing about PowerShell remote is you could pass 100 server names in, and it will run against all of them and send you back the data. But there's nothing yet that I've written that will take that and sort of aggregate it. What I personally envision this as is you are designing infrastructure as code. You're writing DSC configurations or Chef or something, and you get to the end, you build a test server, and you want to make sure your configuration actually applied how you think it did. And we've actually found a number of issues with this test with PoshSpec, where, like I mentioned, we were sort of hastily developing custom resources quite rapidly, and there were some where the test resource was always returning true or false or one or the other. So basically, every single time it ran, it didn't think there was anything to do. But yet every time we looked at the server, it was clearly not configured correctly. Unit testing would have also found that if we'd actually written unit tests for our custom resource. So do that as well. But even then, make sure you validate that when you're configuring servers automatically, that the final configuration is exactly what you were expecting it to be.
Okay, you answered our last question too, because our last question was, but doesn't DSC check my stuff? Which,
yes.
I guess if it only checks what you told it to check.
Right. DSC checks what you tell it to check, but it also it checks that particular resource. So say you are just hacking away, you have this huge config file, and you create a configuration that you create a file or change some configs. And then later in it, you create something that changes it back or changes to something else. Both of them are going to come back true, or true one time. You're going to end up bouncing back and forth, and you could again end up with what DSC thinks is an okay configuration because it applied both of them successfully, but it's actually not what you're expecting. And then there's some also when you really start to get into configurations. So configurations, again, are just functions, and you can write PowerShell to generate configurations. And when you start sort of getting into complex configurations, you're probably going to do that. Like if server is type A, then run this particular configuration item. If server is type B, run this configuration item. So you may get a situation where the configuration doesn't even include the resources you think it should include, because you can build configs that are completely just dynamic. And at that point, yeah, you can't trust just because DSC completed successfully that you have the server configured as you expect it to be.
We're getting more and more questions coming in as you go through everything. Really pertinent question is, how do I add my own custom functions beyond the ones that are already there?
You're welcome to.
So how do I add like an additional test?
Yeah. So let me pull up some documentation on that. I do have some information on how to create a custom test. And there are some requirements. Unfortunately, so this is a big limitation of PowerShell. There's no way for me to really enforce these through code. You just have to sort of do it, and just it's either going to work or it's not. But you have to have at least a target and a should in your function, and you can optionally implement a property and a qualifier. So let me go to I think that's okay. Yeah, I guess I'll do SimObject. So this is the SimObject function. So I have a target, I have a property, and I have a should block. And how you use those are sort of up to you. They are simply have to be named target, property, and should, because they get passed directly as is to get PoshSpec param. And get PoshSpec param is expecting a target, a property, optionally a qualifier, and a should. So, and then based on, sort of which of those you provide, like I said, you get different output name strings, and it builds the expression slightly differently. So for example here, this one's a little bit wonky because to shortcut providing the namespace, I actually will split the string. So if you provide like namespace computer / namespace, I believe, namespace / class name. So you can fully qualify a sim object. Whereas if you were doing get sim instance, you can actually see those would be separate. So again, the goal of all of the functions and PoshSpec in general is just to reduce the amount of typing and code you have to write. So, but in this case, target is class name, and I actually create qualifier based on splitting the namespace from the class. Another example, so registry in this case, I'm using target as the path, and property would be like a particular key at that path. So example, look at the TCP IP parameters for this property and or this key, and the value of that key should be mybiz.local. So again, the requirements are that you have a target and a should, and target is basically the the instance that you want to test. So like for get service, the target is service name. For file, the target would be path. This is sort of basically the unique identifier of the instance that you want to test. And then the other sort of wacky thing is the should block. And this vexed me for quite a while. And I've actually had some discussions with Steve Morawski because he doesn't like how the PoshSpec syntax is different than Pester. So in native Pester, you would get your thing and then you pipe it to should. In mine, should is provided as a script block that gets executed later. And the unfortunate reason for that is because you cannot define a should outside of an it block. And since I'm dynamically generating the it block after the should, I have to sort of short circuit it. So that's why there's a slightly different syntax, unfortunately. And that is a limitation of using the Pester framework, which, again, I was intentionally sort of breaking the way it did things because I didn't want to write all of this out. So there's a little bit more information here, but really, if you want to develop one, look at some of the existing ones. There's obviously a number of options to take a look at, sort of doing it all different ways, and some of them are far more complex and some of them are much simpler. So like start with file, which basically doesn't do much, but the meat and potatoes of it is there's two things. One, you get a PoshSpec param, which is just a hash table of parameters, and you pass it to invoke PoshSpec expression.
That screen's a little bit on the small side to see
sure.
as well again.
Switch to this one.
Oh, sure. Switch to this one.
And I can make this a little bit bigger too. And then, so invoke PoshSpec expression, you can see it's just creating an it block and running your test. And the advantage of sticking this in a separate function is all of the tests. So I'm using Pester to test my PoshSpec, which is written in Pester. By the way, that was also a little bit tricky. Because I cannot call Pester scripts from within Pester, because then it starts like overwriting itself. But what I can do is I can get the PoshSpec params for all the tests and then just make sure that they're returning the correct test name and the correct expression. So also a little bit of a way to see sort of how the internals of designing a function work is to look at the tests as well. So the PoshSpec param returns a name and an expression. And this is an example of one of the expressions it's returning, which looks like this again. Just basically creating this string of PowerShell. So you're welcome to, pull this down locally and add functions to your own version. Definitely very much appreciate if you push them up, because again, the goal of this is to reduce the amount of friction for writing your tests. So if you can write a little bit of a helper function that helps you, then it probably helps somebody else. And I think I have started to theorize about a possible major revision where the functions exist as individual modules, so that you don't have to publish back to the PoshSpec repository to sort of get them in mainstream. You could create your own standalone, helper module, and PoshSpec would, figure out how to go out and find them basically as plugins and make them available for you. The goal is, if you wanted to sort of create a repository of your own functions, and it doesn't make sense to, obviously merge them back into the public repository. Maybe they're specific to your environment, or, very, very niche or whatever. I don't want to create an issue where there's, you have to maintain custom code, and then if you want to get an update to, the main code, you have to overwrite yours and merge stuff back in. So I haven't figured out really how to create a plugin system in PowerShell yet, but I think that'd be the next best option. So
how many of the test types do you have that came from you versus came from the community right now?
I wrote 60% of them. So actually, that's a little too big. If I go and show you, nope, that's the one I wanted. Oh, look, somebody's here. Wrote some stuff.
Brandon's in the chat room too.
Cool. So in terms of lines of code, I have, I've not contributed significantly more than anybody else to this project. Like I said, it's not the most fancy PowerShell project, at all. The guts of the module is 59 lines of code. I mean, this is really everything sort of fancy happens in here, and these mostly just end up as param blocks, so that you can, give things aliases or do validation sets and sort of just make the user experience a little bit easier. I mean, having validation sets on some of these is really handy, so you don't have to remember all the possible HTTP parameters that you could test for. So you're sort of providing a little bit of documentation for people. So it's a lot of this it's just a repository of knowledge. I mean, none of these are super advanced. It takes a little bit of time to get your head around, because I'm doing some weird things to get PoshSpec param. But I've found people have picked it up pretty quickly.
So there's a question in chat. So let's say you wanted to do this on an automated schedule and then pick up the results somehow. If you output it as NUnit or whatever, is that one of the options to keep that from Pester?
Yeah, you can do NUnit.
So again, another design goal, by utilizing Pester natively and not trying to alter it, means I can use all the functionality of Pester. So I can script demo. Demo 1. And then there's a couple different ways. You can output NUnit XML, or you can do pass-through. And that gives you an object-based representation of the output. And so here you can actually interrogate the results. If you did want to programmatically look to that. Let me see if I have this installed. I also have Pester. I haven't used it in a while. Yeah, there you go.
Can you zoom in on that a little?
So this was format Pester as a module somebody wrote to produce, an HTML report of Pester output. I didn't do anything to make PoshSpec work in this because it's expecting the Pester output, and I'm producing Pester tests with legitimate Pester output. So this just works right out of the box. So actually, I guess a couple months ago, I wrote a blog post entitled, I think, "The Pester Pipeline," about just the abundance of things that have sort of sprouted up around Pester. It's a great, obviously community supported, Microsoft supported tool. You can expect to find it on all PowerShell 5 installations now. So it's probably the first thing I've seen in PowerShell that we've really started to see this additive effect of building modules on top of modules. There's very few modules you go out to on the PowerShell gallery and they have dependencies on other modules that other people wrote. And Pester has sort of broken down that barrier in some cases. So like I said, this is one of the possible ways you can consume this. So you could email this to your team or whatever if you wanted. I think there's somebody in the chat who's done something with Pester and something about reporting it to. He's not on. He can't actually speak for himself, can he?
No, that's Brandon again, talking about the Watchmen project.
Yes.
Watchmen project that he has. It's pretty fantastic.
So another part on here that I meant to demo, but I don't think I have the prerequisites necessary, but there is another Microsoft project called OVF, or Operational Validation Framework. And it took me a while to sort of get my head around what that's doing. It's so simple. It's kind of not obvious, but basically Jim Truer at Microsoft created this simple Pester runner that looks through modules for a specific folder structure to find and execute Pester tests. And the sort of aha moment was, well, if they're modules, that means you can package them up and publish them on the gallery or an internal repository or something. And now you have a published set of tests that you can install anywhere and invoke. And so that also works because, again, PoshSpec tests are ultimately just calling Pester. So you could package these up as a module. You could invoke them using OVF and then output to format Pester. And you basically have created this nice pipeline of test functionality. And then again, if you're package them up well, you can publish them to the gallery and sort of define, you create an IIS server and you want to sort of publish a lockdown test script to make sure that it's secure and set up well. You can publish that and everybody can sort of use that. And now we have a sort of community best practice and you're not writing those on your own. So again, I think the cool part about all of this.
Has anybody written any example OVFs that we could take a look at that use PoshSpec?
I have some somewhere.
You said leading edge. If you go to Dev Black Ops on GitHub, he's got one for Active Directory and one for I think a basic Windows server.
Is it using?
I don't know if you've taken a look at those yet.
Yeah, I haven't. All right, where's he hiding them? Are they under Watchman?
There's a search bar at the top.
Really? All right, so there you go. So yeah, look at that. It's looks like a module. It's got a PSD1, but the sort of secret sauce is it's looking for a diagnostic simple or a diagnostic complex folder, and within that, you have some Pester tests. And yes, look at that. They are PoshSpec syntax. So super cool.
Can you zoom in a little bit? That's hard to read.
Sure. Yep. Every tab requires new zoom. There we go. Yeah, so I think Brandon created the DNS function. That's actually just the service, but there's also I think somebody created a DNS function as well. So the challenge I found is I can barely keep up with the contributions to PoshSpec. I went on vacation in August and I came back and there were like 6 pull requests and 9 new issues. It was a first experience for me of having to manage a public. I mean, I have like 40 repos open and, maybe I get like a pull request every 2 years. So this entirely different experience. So also very cool. It was.
Does Ticketmaster pay to work on it?
Yes.
Does Ticketmaster pay to work on PoshSpec? Okay.
Yes, sort of.
That's pretty cool.
I mean, it serves a purpose for us, right? So I probably couldn't have gotten away with it if it were something that took a month to write, but spending a couple days to sort of build this framework makes it much easier for everybody on the team to write infrastructure tests. And so a big part of those is, one, it's it's one thing to write them, but the other thing is you have to keep them up to date. So every time you change your configuration management or your documentation on how something changes, you need to keep your tests up to date as well. So again, making sure that your tests are easy to write and easy to read and understand was a sort of a big benefit.
The Boston User Group just chimed in. They want to know if it took more time for you to write it or getting authorization to open source it.
It took more calendar days to get it approved. But so I definitely have an advantage. So Ticketmaster obviously has an existing open source we already have guidelines and sort of a process for getting things approved. So it took a bit of time to get approval up through my sort of direct chain of command, but once it reached the CTO level, it took 5 minutes. So it wasn't too difficult. And I think
Was it harder to get that done than to contribute upstream to projects that you were already using, just because it was new?
Yeah, the hardest part is, so we run into it a lot, is where we're the Windows team, so we're different. Everything we do just seems to be different. So like we go and say, okay, here's what we want to do, and they say, well, here's how we do it, and we're like, cool, that works for you guys, but we don't use Jenkins, we use TeamCity or something, or so a lot of it is trying to figure out, if we're going to publish this, we have to do it right so that everybody can contribute effectively and we can maintain it. So right now, I don't have PoshSpec running through any continuous integration. So I'm still building it by hand. And the next time, sort of the reason we haven't done further contributions to the Ticketmaster repo is we're trying to figure out how we want to manage that going forward. If we're going to run these through our internal CI build, or if we're going to use AppFair or all that sort of project minutia that has nothing to do with the actual module itself, but maintaining it and making sure it gets published and tested, and I'm not spending an hour testing manually and invoking publish module and all that stuff. So PoshSpec sort of broke the ice, but we're being a little bit more cautious and thoughtful for the next ones. Plus the next modules will probably be a little bit more than 60 lines of code.
So is there anything that you wanted to cover that you haven't been able to find a kind of a loop into yet? Or are there any things that you want to know from the community or anything like that?
No, so far everything there sort of meets my needs. I was surprised by how broad the desired usage was. As soon as I published it, like, people were saying, well, can you do this with it? I'm like, wow, I never even thought of that. It was just kind of overwhelming, actually. And I will say, I guess, as a challenge of maintaining sort of an open source project, something I was not mentally prepared for is sort of taking on that gatekeeper role of you built something and it means something to you, but there's this group of other people who see a potential other use, and do you make changes to sort of meet their needs or maintain the goals that you were trying to accomplish? So definitely a lot of stuff to think about if you're looking to open source.
Doesn't seem like anybody else around me has questions, so that means it's my turn to be obnoxious. So one of the things that one of the things I was thinking about when I was going through it, actually when I was doing the initial contribution, was that we might want to consider using MarkDocs for the documentation side of it, because then we could deploy it as a static site and all that.
Yeah, I actually messed around with. Oh, I guess I removed them. I used PlatEPS to generate the Markdown files. The sort of downside is that they produce kind of wonky Markdown, so it's not something you could straight publish to a static site, but it does get you like 90% of the way. And I totally agree. It would be a lot easier than, like I said, man, I thought the wiki was going to work out well until I realized you cannot fork it. You can't, like, nobody else can contribute to it. So super, it's a Git repo on my machine that nobody else can contribute to. That sort of defeats the purpose of Git. So you could obviously make edits on the site directly. I think actually probably not. I probably can't give anybody access to that. So yeah, I'm definitely interested in better ways of doing documentation, because that's a big part of it, is figuring out what's available and what those do and how to use them.
So then a sort of follow-up question then is, what are some contributions you would like to see from the community? What's some stuff that is hard to work on and you'd like to kind of muscle out?
I think the testing definitely.
Or areas that you think we should have tests for.
Yeah, the testing is weak. I think, because right now I'm testing like one scenario for each function, and I know there are some issues. So one of the biggest things right now preventing me from kind of moving forward with this is dealing with freaking quotations. There are some, specifically like software product was one that came up. There are some software product names that have like an apostrophe in it, which just sort of ruins your whole string, because I go in and try and interpret the string as and sort of dynamically build out the variables and whatnot, and of course PowerShell gets messed up when you start adding in extra apostrophes and single quotes and double quotes. So I honestly haven't figured out a good way to do it yet, and figuring out a way to do it with regex or something that gets rid of this expand string functionality would also open up to using it on back revs of PowerShell. So I think, I mean, I know it's totally doable. It's not hard to do a regular expression search through a string and replace the variables, but there's a lot of conditions to account for that it's just going to take some sitting down to think about. So
That's fair. So I guess since it looks like we're out of questions and everything, last little bit, I heard that you are speaking in the spring at the summit. Is that true?
It is true. I'm speaking
It is true.
on not PoshSpec, but I am speaking on mocking. So I offered to do a whole entire 45 minutes just on mocking. In my experience, it's one of the
So
most.
we can go and mock you in the spring, is what I'm
It's one of
hearing.
the most.
Yes, exactly. It's one of the most challenging parts of testing. So I figured I would try and share my experience with that. And I'm also doing a joint session with Kirk Monroe on, well, I guess we're calling it advanced commandlet development. And that doesn't mean like using commandlet binding, but doing the crazy things like class inheritance and binary commandlets and interfaces and all the stuff we can come up with that ways to get faster and better PowerShell commandlets.
Cool. So I will put some links down at the bottom of the live stream afterwards for everything we've talked about. So I guess last bit here, is there anything that you want to recommend that people check out or take a look at or anything like that? And or can we buy you a coffee?
Yeah, sure. You can always buy me a coffee. Well, things to check out. That's sort of a broad topic. Yes, there's lots of things to check out. Mostly.
Can you recommend specifics?
Mostly.
Not really, because I haven't found a good specific resource for sort of here's how to do PowerShell testing. It's still a very new topic to most people. And if you look at unit testing for another language, your head's going to explode because unit testing C# is like 1,000 times worse. Pester is actually so simple to use compared to trying to mock multiple inherited classes and stuff. So I can suggest if you want sort of an abstract high level, here's a good place to go to kind of get better at development. I'm currently reading a book called The Imposter's Handbook. It's an ebook written by a self-taught developer about all the computer science-y stuff that you don't learn if you are a self-taught developer and sort of didn't actually go through college for computer science. So it goes through, among other things, test-driven development, behavior-driven development, and sort of the high level of why it exists, you know, the topics or the syntax. Goes through a lot of things like the definitions of a stack and how to sort things like, you know, bubble sorts and all those things that, you know, we don't do anymore. And PowerShell definitely abstracts away from you, but to understand the difference between like array plus equals and array list add, why those are so fundamentally different performance wise, you have to understand like memory management for an array is basically static. You create an array and that's it. If you want to add something to it, you create a whole new array with one larger dimension and insert that extra value at the end. So it's very expensive. So yeah, that's probably where I would start if you're interested in just a really broad book on improving development, because once you get past just executing commandlets, PowerShell is development. So you're going to benefit by sort of improving and learning those development skills.
Okay, very last question. My Surface is giving up. It looks like streaming has killed it completely. So last question from the chat room before we cut out. Ravi wants to know why PoshSpec instead of ServerSpec? Do they complement each other? Do you use one instead of the other? What does that look like?
I would not say. I would say use one or the other. The advantage of PoshSpec is it runs on PowerShell. That primary design goal. I don't want to install Ruby or another runtime on my servers just so I can run infrastructure tests. I'm running all Windows servers. I already have PowerShell installed. We are not a chef shop, so again, I don't maintain Ruby runtimes on the servers. There are a lot of perfectly good testing, infrastructure testing things out there. And there's no reason not to use those, especially if you're already using them for Linux or anything like that, definitely. And you can use PoshSpec for completely other different things too. I mean, like the HTTP checks that an address responds to HTTP, and you can check the content or something. You could actually write a bunch of tests that actually make sure your website is working as expected. You could make sure that, when you publish changes to your blog that, break all the links or something. So, it's just a toolbox.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for everything that you put into this to get this to work for us. We really appreciate it. Looks like the chat room has had a good time participating and keeping up with it as well.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, you did an awesome job, man.
Thank you.
Pretty impressed that you pulled this off. I've never even attempted a remote session.
Pulled this off barely.
Yeah, barely. Maybe. So, again, thank you for having me. It's cool to be part of another user group. Keep PowerShelling.
Absolutely. And on that note, good night, everybody.
All right. Good night.